Okay, so welcome to this fun interview. We're doing something a little bit different today. It's been a while since I've done a face to face interview with anybody, but I was just so excited to bring this story to you all that I wanted to record video. So, very excited to welcome Shira Page today. And I'm going to let Shira tell you all about herself. And what we're going to be talking about is um, more of a non-traditional nurse practitioner role that Shira has. And we're going to dive into a little bit of her story and always like to share these opportunities with you when I'm learning about people who are just doing really cool things with their nurse practitioner certifications. So I think you will really enjoy this. So Shira, welcome. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm a big fan. I have to say that off the bat, Amanda. I've had, as we'll talk about, I've had multiple career pivots. Um, and during those times, I always kind of, anytime I'm struggling, I go to podcasts. And I, have found you during those times and really found the stories of other NPs to be super inspirational and help guide me, even if they were in totally different paths or had totally different goals. Like they really help you figure out what is going to work for you, what's not going to work for you. So thank you for the work that you do. It's super powerful for
Well,
NPs.
thank you. Thank you. It's my pleasure. And yeah, I really think that we're so much, I don't know, so much better together. Like it sounds so corny, but when we can learn and see and hear what other people are doing, whether it's the type of role we're in or how we're balancing work and family life, which I'm sure we'll chat about, or, even talking about salary transparency, like there's so much transparency that we can bring. And I'm just happy to kind of be that vessel and bring those stories to people so that, we as NPs can know what's possible for us. Because I feel like unless we're seeing people doing things or hearing about them, like there are so many things that we just don't know are possible for us. So I'm glad that it's been helpful to you. And now you are going to be one of those voices for others, which I think will be really exciting. So I'd love for you to start with a bit of an introduction. Tell us a little bit about yourself, kind of what you do currently, and then we'll probably go into your timeline of your journey thus far.
Yeah, totally. So I am technically a board certified adult gerontological primary care nurse practitioner. Um, and I am also a certified lactation counselor. And right now, what my job looks like is that I work full time at an infant formula startup called Bobby. And what I do there is manage kind of everything that faces the clinician. So, our medical outreach to practitioners, the education that we put out for them, and information, how we help them understand the product and educate them and improve infant feeding clinical care. And then I also have not let go totally of doing clinical care, um, in part because, it's just kind of ingrained in me that it's something that I don't want to totally let go of. And then just more practically, I don't want to have to retake for a NP boards again. So I want to keep those, I think it's 1,000 hours over the course of 5 years. I just want to keep that up. So I do work just a few hours a week for a diabetes and weight management telemedicine company. And that's kind of how I keep my direct patient care going.
That's awesome. I was going to ask you, and you already answered. So you're not seeing patients in your full time role. It's great that you're keeping up with something on the side. I'm in a similar boat. That's part of why I returned to clinical practice this past year. Was I can't retake my boards. I have the adult NP certification, which has since been retired in favor of the AGNP certification. So I'm out of options if I don't keep up
Oh
my
gosh.
clinical hours. So I'm with you there, but that's great that you're doing both. And so your day to day with Bobby is is really more of an administrative role, would you say? Like, how would you describe like what you're doing throughout your day? Are you mostly working internally with your coworkers? Are you mostly facing with other clinicians? What does that look like?
Yeah, so it's a startup, which means that it's ever changing what I'm doing. When I first started, it was a lot of kind of supporting some of the ongoing things that we had going on, like how we get clinicians access to product, what sort of webinars and continuing education that we do. And with some restructuring of the company and the way that we divide scientific affairs versus more medical facing business endeavors, it has really expanded into a quite multifaceted role. So I work internally to help support the content that we put out for clinicians, to make sure that other aspects of the company are aligned with how we're communicating with the clinical audience. The majority of the company is not coming from the medical space. And so infant formula is, it kind of exists in this gray area, right? So it's not like a typical consumer packaged good, like a food product or a cosmetic product, but it's also not a pharmaceutical. So the focus early on in the company was very much on that consumer side of things. And as we are growing the way that we interact with clinicians, there's more of a need for a clinical voice and how you reach that audience. So there's that side of things. And then I also do a lot of external work, both with just interfacing with practitioners, reaching out to medical practices, talking with clinicians who are interested in learning more about Bobby or infant feeding. And then I also talk to a lot of founders of other health tech companies that are in the women's health or parent space to figure out how we can collaborate to kind of share the populations that we're reaching. So my kind of biggest project for this year is something called Feeding Friendly, which is our medical community and how we reach clinicians who are interested in having more dynamic, holistic conversations about infant feeding, kind of figuring out how to serve the modern parent, and breaking down this long-standing dichotomy that's existed in the infant feeding space between like very heavy dogmatic breast is best messaging, and then those practitioners who really only know about formula and kind of can even misuse it in a parent whose goals are long-term breastfeeding. So bringing those together through education, through networking, through community, a lot of clinicians kind of see this dichotomy and see that it's not serving parents, but they just don't have the bandwidth to like further their education on either end or find other practitioners to talk to about it. So really excited to, I love talking to clinicians all day and figuring out kind of what their pain points are and how we on the industry side of things can help to alleviate those pain points and better patient care.
That's so awesome. And I'm curious, when you found this job, what was it a job posting? If it was, like, what was the job posting for? Was it for an RN? Was it for a CLC? Was it for an APRN? Curious about that.
Yeah, that's such a good question. So when I found the job, I was actually looking to go into the health tech space, but I didn't want to do telemedicine. So I was all over the place with the type of roles I was looking for. And I would be on LinkedIn, like looking up product manager. Like I didn't even know I think what a product manager really did, but I'd be like, could I be a product manager? Could I be like in learning and development? Trying to fit into these boxes that didn't really make sense for someone with clinical experience and would definitely have discounted my clinical experience for a complete career pivot. And then I happened to find this role at Bobby, which was posted as medical community manager. I simultaneously found another similar role at another infant formula company. And it was kind of just serendipity. I was like, oh, this is like they both roles were looking for someone who was a clinician, who had knowledge about infant feeding, who understood the landscape of infant feeding amongst clinical people, which includes not just on the very heavy, like patient, traditional patient care, pediatric and obstetric side, but also lactation providers, doulas, birth workers, which is a space that I've kind of been in peripherally for a long time. So it felt like a really, really good fit. I think the role was very broad for anyone with some sort of clinical background or a touch point in the clinical space. So it definitely, it could have been an RD. It probably could have been someone who'd just been working in pharmaceuticals or interfacing with providers heavily. But I think that we already have, at the time that I started, the only two other in-house clinical people there are a dietitian and a pharmacist, and then another dietitian. So I think adding another element from a different part of the professional landscape was helpful just to diversify perspectives.
Yeah, definitely. That's really neat. So I want to back up a little bit and kind of learn about the steps that you took to get to this point. So, take me back to your RN career, becoming an NP, and then the roles that you've had since being an NP.
Yeah. So every time I talk about this, I kind of feel a little self-conscious that I'm like the master of pivots. And this is like a long-standing thing for me. I was one of those kids who like would do an activity for a few weeks. And if it wasn't working out for me, I'd be like, oh, see you, I'm quitting soccer. And like, I only wanted to do activities where I felt like I could really move forward quickly. That's just my personality, for better or worse. And there's definitely some downsides to that, but I think ultimately it's kind of about advocating for yourself and having, in some ways, the privilege to abandon something that isn't serving you, but also just understanding the value of your satisfaction in career, and that you don't have to necessarily just stick something out if it's not working for you, right? So I won't give you like everything about my background, but starting off, in college, I got my undergraduate degree in dietetics. I knew I wanted to be in the healthcare space. I was super interested in eating disorder treatment and also alternative medicine and nutrition. So it seemed like a good fit. I went to the undergraduate program for the RD pathway is pretty straightforward. Like it's very much designed to funnel you into the master's programs for RDs. So I completed that undergraduate degree, and at the end of that, you have to go through a very competitive process to get into these RD internships. They actually use like essentially a match program that's like similar to what MDs do. So it's very, very competitive. And there's a master's academic program alongside that. So, I was looking at a few years of extra education and also this very competitive process. And I was starting to feel a little limited by the scope of being an RD, and kind of like I had always wanted to expand into other medical aspects. So I had never heard of graduate entry pathway programs before. I think I stumbled upon one. It was like, hey, this is the same length as getting an RD. I already have all the prerequisites. So I went ahead and applied to those. The graduate entry pathway program that I did, since, I know they're all different and constantly evolving, that was a 9-month RN. And then you were required to work a certain amount of hours as a registered nurse while you got your master's and you did your NP clinical hours. So I can't say that was a fun experience. It was very, very intense. I know there's a lot of critique, especially now, of graduate entry pathway programs. And I think that program did the best that it could to really make it a quality experience where you came out prepared. at the same time, it's just a very short time to leave and be prepared to practice primary care, which is, what the program was intending for us to do. So I knew pretty early on in that experience that certain things were just not clicking for me. At first, when I was doing the RN time, I could be like, oh, I just don't like bedside nursing. And then, as I would do my clinicals, I would be like, oh, well, I just don't like primary care. And, I think that when I started to think about what I was going to do after that, I started to kind of try to look outside very early. Like I started looking into alternative medicine and functional medicine roles. I did have a really strong passion for women's health, but as I was looking for roles, I just honestly hadn't gotten the right education. Like I got an A&P. I don't think that, you have to make that decision like without all the contacts and understanding the hiring market. And at the time I was like, oh, I can't do any extra clinical hours. Like I just have to get this done. So I was not finding the roles in women's health, and I had the opportunity to take an outpatient job as an endocrinology NP, where the physician working there was willing to kind of train me from the ground up. And, it kind of aligned with my interest. It logistically made sense. So I took that role. I'd never planned on working in endocrinology before that. And it was a really fantastic experience. Like the learning curve was super steep, but I was very supported from a work-life balance perspective. It was definitely, in hindsight, when I think about it, it was pretty low volume. Like I never stayed late. I rarely charted in the evenings. I had a relatively flexible schedule, and I had a lot of autonomy. So I was there for about 3 years, and then I got pregnant with my first daughter. And I think that kind of made me like step back and question, what does the future look like? I, like many people in the healthcare space, unfortunately, I had absolutely zero paid maternity leave. So at the hospital that I worked at, I'm based in the Boston area. The majority of Boston area hospitals require you to use your sick time for your maternity leave, which is absolutely absurd. And so I was aggravated about that. And then I had asked to return from maternity leave in a part-time capacity, which they were just not open to at all. So I decided that, I kind of just wanted to step back, do per diem work here and there, and figure out what made the most sense for me after that. Like kind of like, I'll figure this out later. Like I just want to have this baby and be able to focus on it. And so I had my daughter, and I was working per diem at a weight loss clinic. It was kind of the perfect role for the time. Per diem, short shifts, great compensation for the amount of work that you were doing, very flexible. But it was not something I wanted to keep doing long term. And so, I think many people who've had kids, that at least for me, there's this period where you just can't, like, you're just trying to get by that first year or so. And so I was like, take care of my daughter. So lucky that I could be with her as much as I could, put in the hours that I needed to financially at work, and, didn't think too much outside of that. And then I think around when she was like 14, 16 months, I was like, oh, like I'm actually really bored at work. This is not stimulating. And I also don't really like being home with her as much as I do. Like I'm ready to figure out what's next for my career. And so I started applying to all sorts of clinical jobs, did a ton of interviews, even was offered some roles, and each one just did not feel like a fit for me. I think I became very kind of practical once I realized that clinical care and medicine maybe wasn't my passion. And I got in this headspace that was like, okay, what is like, it sounds so ridiculous, but I was like, what is the like highest paying hourly job I can have where I can just like clock in and clock out. And that's where I was. Like, it felt very helpless. Like, that was my only option, is to figure out how to maximize the time that I was working. And so I was getting these jobs where I just knew that I was going to be like a lot of my friends, working 60, 70 hours a week, charting in evenings, charting on weekends, having like being on call on the weekends. I remember I interviewed for one job that was, basically like the same pay I had been making in my endocrine role. And it was every weekend, 24 hours. And on top of like a full schedule. And when I tried to negotiate salary with them, they were just like totally taken aback. So I just felt like the way that kind of clinicians were being valued in the jobs that I was applying to didn't make sense. And I happened to come upon a job at a CME company, so a continuing medical education company. And I didn't really know, like, I'll be quite honest, I didn't really understand like what I would be doing there. But I was like, oh my gosh, a non-clinical role that's hiring clinicians, that pays well, and that would teach me new skills, which is something that felt really exciting to me. So I took that role. I also was working per diem in urgent care at the time, and I took that role in January or December of 2019. And so I was like, so excited to get my office clothes and going into the office. And
I see where this is going.
I see where this is going. And, going on work trips. Like, it's so easy to kind of glamorize the grass on the other side of things. But then I was enjoying it, but it was also like going into the office, and some of the amount of travel was definitely challenging. And then COVID happened, and my company went fully remote. And everyone else who was in a clinical role was like in complete crisis. And that was definitely a challenging time for me. I think a lot of people who have clinical degrees who were not working clinically during early COVID had some identity crises happening. Yes, just because there was a lot of, praise of healthcare workers. There was a healthcare worker shortage in many domains. And that was a hard time to be like, oh, I've made this decision to not work clinically. It really kind of fast tracked any sort of questioning that I would have of whether that had been the right decision for me. And ultimately, I think it taught me to value my own needs, to kind of step back from this idea that we can get so fixated on as our identity being entangled with some sort of martyrdom that's associated with being a clinician, that, I didn't have to sacrifice potentially my family's health, my own health. I had wanted to have another baby at the time, like the safety of a pregnancy, the like stress level. Like, I didn't have to just completely throw all my needs aside for the greater good, because the healthcare system was failing. And unfortunately, that is true to this day. Like, I see a lot of people feel like they can't step away from their clinical roles because there's a shortage, or because the healthcare system is crumbling. And, I think that's really unfair to themselves. There's no need to do that. Like, it's not our responsibility to hold up the healthcare system from the bottom up. So, that's kind of a long-winded way of saying that I came to terms with being in a non-clinical role. I let go of my urgent care hours because I was like, I'm not going to go in 4 hours a week or 4 hours a month and risk getting COVID. That doesn't make any sense. And so I really leaned into this role that I had that was in an industry environment. And that role allowed me to, it started very clinically focused, like making clinical content and providing insights from the clinician perspective. But I was able to expand that into working with the sales team, into partnerships with pharmaceutical companies and major medical societies. I was very supported by the management there to kind of grow as a employee outside of just what I had to offer from a clinical level. And that's kind of what led me to where I am now. I think I, had the support I needed to kind of exponentially grow in skills that you don't have innately as a clinician, just because I was in an environment that really leveraged and respected clinical people in a way that I don't feel I could have done in a clinical setting. I think there's a lot of, when I was trying to figure out how to kind of grow as a clinician, I listened to a lot of nurse innovator podcasts and like followed a lot of those kind of more clinical nurse innovators. And I just didn't feel like I felt like that was the only direction in clinical care that you could really advance. And that didn't feel like the right fit for me. So I feel very fortunate that I had that opportunity, but ultimately I think that there's many opportunities like that. It's just kind of figuring out where they are and understanding how to value yourself and your skills.
I think that's really great. And it sounds like that role at the CME company really was a good foundation for you in this role now, with them both being kind of more, I mean, can you say industry roles? Is
Yeah.
that a fair term? More they're both non-clinical roles, and you're kind of doing you're using a really diverse skill set, and probably, gained a lot of skills from that first role to prepare you for this next one. So that's really,
Yeah.
really great to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. And saying industry is perfect. It's a perfect term.
Yeah.
Usually what I say.
Yeah. So for anyone who's listening, this is the term. If you like what you're hearing and you want this type of role, that's the insider term we're going to use, I suppose. So I'm really curious, like how you feel that um, working in a non-clinical role and in these types of roles have helped you kind of in your overall sense of self, in your parenting self, like your overall work-life satisfaction. Like, tell me a little bit more about that, because just because you're not seeing patients every day doesn't mean that you're exempt from any sort of difficulties when it comes to work and work-life balance. But I have to imagine that there's some benefits. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty loaded question. And I've definitely gone through different phases with each setting that I was in. I think the initial impetus coming from work-life balance and parenting to step away from clinical care is that I felt like I just couldn't be a caregiver 24/7. So clinicians are caregivers. You're responsible for other individuals, whether you're a bedside nurse or you are, in an outpatient setting, managing a whole panel, like that never stops. And I felt very overwhelmed by parenting and the responsibility to care for another person, um, to care for my family. And that was a new learning curve that I didn't feel that I could manage at the same time as continuing to be a caregiver in my day-to-day job. So stepping away from that, even to, a clinical role that had lower stakes or felt like a lot simpler, lower risk, a lot more kind of clock in, clock out type of role, I felt like it allowed me to be a better parent. Like I just needed to prioritize that self-sacrifice caregiving for my family. And I know that's not everyone's experience, but that was definitely mine. And then, the role that I had at the CME company, it's pretty complex conversation because the majority of it was during COVID. So that for me was a time where work really became quite secondary. It was very hard for me to think about anything outside of my family and just like what was happening in the world, at least for, the first year or so. So I felt like I had a role that it was it was not all consuming. It was very easy for me to get my work done, to not have it spill over into my day to day, and then to leave that work aside and focus on my family, which is absolutely what I needed at the time. And it's a little bit ironic that that's what I felt was the value of an industry role now that I've transitioned to Bobby, because I think what started to happen for me at my CME role is, you know, I started to feel the flip side of that, which is that I was very disconnected from my work and it didn't feel like it had a greater purpose. And it's actually kind of one of the many reasons that I started to look for a different role. So there's kind of two sides of that coin. One is that you can kind of leave your work at work and go to focus on your family, and it's very easy to create boundaries. And then the other side of that is that I just wasn't excited and I didn't feel super passionate or like I was making enough of an impact. So I got the job at Bobby, which was the complete opposite of that, which is something, that I am incredibly passionate about, that I eat, sleep, and breathe. And that is so exciting to me on every moment that I am working. And that comes with some downsides, that comes with some challenges in separating yourself from work, both identity wise and also in terms of just the ability to shut off, create boundaries, to not let it bleed into family. So I think because it was such a sharp shift for me, it's something, I'm almost a year into my role that I'm recalibrating. I never had a clinical role that I felt like emotionally took over my entire life. Even if, it was time consuming, it still wasn't something that I felt like I could never step away from. And I feel very much with my role right now that I am, just so passionate about what we are doing and what we're building. And also just there's a mountain of work to do at growing a startup that it can be really hard to step away. So I'm definitely like one of my goals for the next few months, looking at having been there for a year, is to try to figure out how to keep that, appreciate that excitement, appreciate that passion, and still find a way to create boundaries and to protect some of the family time. But I think it's interesting to live on both sides of that and to experience them. And I don't know what the right answer is. Like, I don't know which is better. I think that there's just different seasons of life where one makes more sense than the other. And it probably makes the most sense to move through them. And maybe in 10 years or 5 years, I'll want a role that I just like feel that is a job and is nothing else. I don't know what will happen, but I think it's really important for your career growth and figuring out what you want to have the opportunity to explore both of those worlds and what they look like.
Definitely. Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. And, I feel similarly in that I've been in, roles that have served both purposes. And there are seasons of life where each of those is needed. And I think part of that is the beauty of our profession, where we really have that flexibility to explore different types of roles that can, some that can be more purpose-driven, impact-driven, all-consuming, and others that can be, clock in, clock out, collect your paycheck and go.
Yeah.
And not every industry, not every profession, I think, has that type of luxury, if you will. But it is something that, I think that we as individuals need to kind of take charge of, and not feel as though this path is being determined for us, but deciding to um, be in charge of the direction, decide to steer the ship, because I think it's so easy to I don't know, be a victim of your circumstance. I don't know if that's the right way to say it, or I certainly don't want to place blame on anybody, but what I want people to take away and hear is, I want you to feel empowered to make a change if something is not aligning, whether you're not aligned with the work that you're doing, or the work isn't aligned with what you need, in your home life and everything. I want people to feel empowered to make a change if they're not in the right setting, which it sounds like you've been really good at, which is really wonderful. And so with that, I wonder if you have any advice to share for maybe people who are looking to explore some non-clinical options. Yeah, what advice would you give?
Yeah, I mean, I do just want to touch on one thing that you said, because I think I did happen to achieve those changes through environment changes, through role changes. But that is absolutely not always the only way to do that. Like in my CME role, once I started feeling like I wanted to be more career driven and be more passionate about my day-to-day work, there were ways to navigate that role to leverage things I was excited about, to get involved in more projects, to try to be more like involved with the conversations happening on the leadership side of things. There's definitely walls in each place that you can only go so far in one direction, and that's maybe when it's time to change. But it doesn't always have to be environment change. Like, you can advocate for shifting those narratives in any role. But to answer your question, I think the first thing that anyone has to do if they want to explore outside of clinical roles is to try to figure out how to break down any mental block that clinical care is superior to other work, because that is definitely it's definitely a narrative in our society. There's a lot of glamorization of clinical care. There is just a sense that work is that level of self-sacrifice and that hands-on patient care is so superior to anything else that's more macro. And that is just something that you have to get over. You have to be okay talking about it at the dinner table and with your friends, and just be prepared to be proud of what you're doing, even if it isn't clinical care, and understand that just because you worked so hard for that degree, you can still be using it, and it doesn't have to be at the bedside or sitting with a patient or hands-on. So I think that's just the first thing, because that will really hold people back and make them continue to question themselves as they're moving forward.
Definitely.
I think another thing is that, you have to understand that when you make a pivot, it's not going to be perfect right away. I have talked to a lot of clinicians looking to leave the clinical space who are frustrated with the fact that they're not getting the jobs they apply to in health tech, because they think, well, I'm a clinician, like, why wouldn't they want me? And it may be that your vision of what you want to do as a clinician outside of the clinical space is like a 5-year plan. It might not be that that's your first job away from clinical, because you have to accept that in some ways you are kind of starting over. It doesn't have to be a complete restart to your career, but there are certain things that you have to build from the ground up. So I think a lot of those entry points for clinicians are kind of a little less sexy than like your classic health tech startup, I think continuing medical education companies are an awesome entry point because they really value clinicians. They really value, having actual medical and scientific knowledge. I think, a little bit harder, but also heavily value clinicians or pharmaceutical companies or medical device companies. And lastly, insurance companies, the least sexy of all of them, but they really do hire clinicians in management roles, in leadership roles. And that's a great way to grow skills in that industry space. So, just keeping that in mind, maybe it's that you do that for 2 years or 3 years or 6 months, but definitely explore those roles as well. And then I think the last thing is just clinicians figuring out how to market themselves outside of clinical care, which I know is we kind of hear this again and again, but really remembering that people outside of clinical medicine just don't actually understand what a clinician does. And they don't understand the massive scope of skills that it requires to be a clinician, inpatient, outpatient, whatever it is that you're doing, but that a lot of those skills are incredibly translatable to other things, and that your ability to function on an extremely steep learning curve under pressure, learning new tools, constantly pivoting, like those are skills that are so incredibly translatable that every clinician who has worked in pretty much any setting has, and very strongly. So, there's a couple different ways to do this, but I think just sitting down and writing like what it is that you do in clinic, what you're responsible for, and then working with anyone who's working. It can be your friend who's like a marketing manager or someone who does sales, like just sitting with someone who's in a very industry role and having them look at those skills and just write out what they mean in like business speak, because I promise that they are skills that are on job descriptions that hiring managers in non-clinical roles are looking for. They just don't understand what it is that you do. So I think that that's something that can also help boost confidence and help people learn how to talk about themselves as something separate from a clinical practitioner.
Those are some really, really great practical tips, especially that last part about, figuring out what you do and what you do well and translating it to the language that other people are speaking, and those other people being, your target, your target employer or the people who you really want to appeal to with your skill set. So I think that's really great and really helpful. And yeah, a lot of this mirrors what I talk about in general, whether you're looking for a clinical job or not. Like, not the first stepping stone may not be your final destination. So many of us will go through many iterations of roles and many different positions. And that's actually a great thing, right? Like when you realize that you can stepstone your way to your final destination, and figure things out as you go. I think that's really, kind of a beautiful part of the journey. And it sounds like that's definitely, what's going to happen in industry and in non-clinical roles as well. So thank you for sharing that advice. And before we wrap up, I'm realizing there may be some people watching or listening who may want to connect with you on the Bobby side of things, people who are clinicians who either want to know more about infant feeding or are really in your kind of target audience to connect with you there. So how can people connect with you?
Yeah, so you can always find me on LinkedIn. Just search Shira Page. I'm open to connection requests. You can email me at Shira, SHIRA, at hibobby.com. But if someone is looking to find out more about the community that we're building, to get involved in conversations, is interested in infant feeding, whether it's that you support parents and babies in clinical practice, or you are a parent, or you just talk to your friends about infant feeding, the best place to go is feedingfriendly.com, and you'll find everything that you need there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Shira, for sharing your experience. And I'm inspired by your story. I know those watching will be too. And thank you for your time.
Awesome. Thank you.